What's the most karmic court moment where someone tried to lie under oath and got exposed immediately? I still remember the hush that fell over the courtroom the moment Judge Hastings banged his gavel and fixed his gaze on Richard, who was standing at the witness stand, sweat beading on his forehead. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. I'd spent months gathering every piece of evidence I could find, fully aware that Richard would never admit what he'd done unless he was backed into a corner. He was the smoothest talker I'd ever met, and for years, I'd actually believed he was my friend. But on that day, when he raised his right hand and lied under oath in front of the entire court, I knew he was about to get hit by the biggest karmic blast of his life. The memory of how he smirked, thinking he had the upper hand, still sends a chill down my spine. But let me back up and tell you how this all started, because the moment I stepped into this entire mess, I had no idea I was about to spend so much time and energy fighting for my own name, my business, and ultimately, my sense of justice. My name is Michael Reeves. I grew up in a small town in Washington State, moved to California for college, and ended up settling in a city near Los Angeles. I'd worked in real estate for nearly a decade by the time I partnered with Richard. When we first met, he seemed like a straight shooter, polite, punctual, knowledgeable about property management, and full of ideas. We'd both been scouting for business opportunities in a developing neighborhood on the outskirts of downtown. It wasn't exactly the nicest area, but it had potential for growth, especially since the city had slated it for redevelopment. We decided to pool resources and buy up a few smaller apartment complexes, fix them up, and rent them out. At first, everything was fantastic. Richard had the gift of gab and easily charmed potential investors and contractors. Meanwhile, I handled the paperwork, negotiations with tenants, and the day-to-day grunt work. It seemed like the perfect partnership. He was always rolling in with a friendly grin, a hot cup of coffee for me, and a pat on my back for a job well done. He promised me that if we stuck to the plan, we'd both make a solid profit within the next 2 years. For a while, we really did. We updated 2 of the apartment buildings, added new security systems, repainted walls, replaced plumbing, and started seeing a decent return on our investment. Richard seemed to be living the good life. He drove a top-of-the-line SUV, traveled on weekends, and entertained clients in flashy restaurants. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, he was older than me by about 10 years and had presumably built some wealth prior to our partnership. But around the time I noticed that the renovation bills were skyrocketing, my alarm bells began to ring. Our construction contractor was one of Richard's longtime friends, a guy named Sean. We'd agreed on a budget for each building, but costs kept going up without any clear explanation. Sean's invoices were vague and padded with weird expenses like special project fees or emergency structural adjustments. I asked Richard to press Sean for clearer documentation, but Richard would always wave it off as if I were being too uptight. He assured me that it was all legit, that older buildings always cost more than expected to fix, and that Sean was doing us a favor by squeezing us in between his more lucrative corporate gigs. The day I got a courtesy call from a realtor buddy who said that he'd heard rumors of Richard funneling money into some personal project, I started investigating. At first, I didn't want to believe it. Richard was my partner, after all. But as I pulled bank statements, cross-referenced receipts, and looked up property records, I noticed glaring inconsistencies. It appeared that a big chunk of our renovation fund was unaccounted for. Around $50,000 had essentially vanished from our business account. I confronted Richard with the discrepancies, hoping it was just some innocent mistake, maybe a misfiled payment or a confusion in the ledger. He laughed it off, told me I was making a mountain out of a molehill, and insisted the money had gone to unexpected code compliance fees. Then he changed the subject and told me about a new business lead that could double our profits. I didn't like his evasiveness, but I also didn't have concrete proof to contradict him yet. Months passed, and we continued to see weird fluctuations in the ledger. Our tenants were happy with the renovations, and we kept collecting rent, but the money left at the end of the month was shrinking at an alarming rate. I started quietly tracking every transaction, every invoice, and every conversation. Richard might not have realized it, but the more suspicious I became, the more meticulously I documented everything. One afternoon, while Richard was supposedly on a business trip, I paid Sean a surprise visit at one of the buildings under renovation. Sean looked startled to see me. When I asked him about these repeated structural adjustments, he seemed confused, then mumbled something vague about how old buildings were tricky. When I pressed for details, he finally said he was just doing what Richard told him to do, and that I should talk to Richard. It was like a circle of misdirection. No one had a straight answer. Not long afterward, things exploded. I received a legal notice from Richard's lawyer, claiming that I, of all people, had been embezzling funds. He was accusing me of misappropriating the renovation budgets. My jaw practically hit the floor. The notice demanded compensation for the stolen money, threatened to dissolve our partnership, and indicated that Richard would take me to court if I didn't pay back the missing funds. That's when it hit me. He was not only stealing from me, but he was trying to pin it on me. Some part of me still couldn't believe he'd go this far. But the legal notice was real, emblazoned with an official letterhead. My anger was instantaneous and white-hot. How dare he try to frame me for his own wrongdoing? I secured a lawyer, Dan Walters, an old friend from college who knew my work ethic and believed in my innocence. Dan took one look at the papers, told me I had a case, and said we'd file a counterclaim. From that point on, it was war. Richard filed a lawsuit claiming I had diverted funds for my own personal investments. I countersued for fraud, providing all the evidence I'd meticulously gathered. Soon enough, the case was scheduled for a preliminary hearing. Stress loomed over me like a constant storm cloud, but adrenaline and a thirst for justice spurred me on. We had our first hearing in front of a judge who looked bored out of his mind, flipping through paperwork while the attorneys from both sides droned on about motion deadlines and discovery. Richard, wearing an expensive suit, smirked at me from across the aisle. I kept my poker face, but inside I was furious. He had the gall to act like I was the one who wronged him. Then came depositions. Hours upon hours of. Richard's lawyer was a slick operator named Greg Phillips, who tried every trick in the book to rattle, asking me about personal debts, my family, random college expenses, anything that might paint me in a bad light. It was exhausting, but Dan was always at my side, objecting where appropriate, steering me back on course when my frustration threatened to boil over. Through all this, we discovered more evidence of Richard's double dealing. Bank transfers made to a shell company in Nevada, suspicious checks endorsed by Sean, sudden deposits in Richard's personal account that coincided with the dates our budget shortfalls appeared. Every time we found something else, Dan's eyes lit up. He told me we had a strong case, but we needed a smoking gun, something definitive that showed Richard was directly orchestrating the embezzlement. So we kept digging. It was pure luck that I ran into one of Sean's former employees at a hardware store. I recognized the guy from a site visit. He looked beaten down like someone who'd just quit or lost his job. I struck up a conversation, cautiously prodding about Sean and Richard. The ex-employee, Mike Turner, was reluctant to talk at first. But once he realized I wasn't looking to cause him trouble, he admitted something huge. Sean had bragged about funneling money to the boss, a nickname for Richard, and forging documentation to inflate renovation costs. Mike left the company because he couldn't stomach the lies anymore. He even had digital copies of some invoices that he suspected were fake. I nearly hugged him on the spot. We exchanged phone numbers and I told Dan. We immediately set up a meeting. Mike provided copies of those invoices which matched the suspicious charges in our accounts. That was the first massive crack in Richard's armor. When the trial date finally arrived, the tension was thick. By then, we'd gone through so many depositions and pretrial motions that I felt like an amateur attorney myself. The case was assigned to Judge Hastings, a stern man in his 50s with a reputation for hating liars. He had a no-nonsense approach and a keen eye for detail. I remember sitting at the plaintiff's table since Richard's lawsuit was the first one on the docket, watching Hastings read through our motions. I couldn't gauge his reaction, but I sensed from the subtle creases on his forehead that he was absorbing every word. On the first day of testimony, Richard took the stand. He wore a dark blue suit and that same smug expression I'd come to despise. He explained, in a calm voice, how I had supposedly channeled money away from the renovations into my personal ventures. He had documents, cleverly doctored ones, showing how I'd transferred funds on certain dates. He feigned heartbreak, saying he trusted me like a brother, but discovered my treachery only months later. His performance was convincing. I'll give him that. He got choked up at one point, claiming I'd betrayed him. Members of the jury even glanced at me skeptically, like maybe I was a con artist. My stomach churned. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed him. But I reminded myself that this was all part of his ruse. Then came my turn. Dan expertly guided me through my side of the story. I detailed the bizarre invoices, the sudden budget shortfalls, the evidence I found in bank statements, and the conversation with Sean's ex-employee. I tried to convey everything honestly, letting the facts speak for themselves. Judge Hastings leaned forward at times, peering over his glasses. Occasionally, he scribbled notes. I could almost see his mind working, connecting the dots. Finally, Sean was called to testify. He stumbled through his answers, avoiding direct eye contact. He insisted the inflated costs were legitimate, referencing all sorts of building issues. But Dan had printouts of every questionable invoice, complete with side-by-side comparisons of normal building expenses in similar properties. Sean's voice shook. He started mumbling about how those numbers might have been, misprinted. The tension in the courtroom shot up. Hastings pressed him for clarity, but Sean squirmed, refusing to give a direct answer. At that point, Richard's lawyer objected, claiming the line of questioning was irrelevant. Hastings overruled the objection. Sweat beaded on Sean's forehead, and I realized we were close to a breakthrough. In the days that followed, we presented a chain of emails between Richard and Sean. I'd subpoenaed phone records, email servers, and anything else I could get my hands on. Even though Richard had tried to delete or hide some correspondence, we managed to recover enough messages showing he was instructing Sean on how to pad the invoices. This was big, but the best was yet to come. Mike Turner took the stand near the end of the trial. He had no reason to lie. He wasn't involved in our business beyond being a grunt laborer for Sean. He had no stakes in the game, no potential for reward by helping me. All he had was his conscience. He told the jury how Sean would brag about a secret arrangement with Richard, about funneling thousands of dollars monthly into side accounts. He also produced a flash drive with digital backups of the original invoice templates that had been manipulated. The timestamps showed they were created specifically to inflate charges. Richard's face paled. His lawyer tried to poke holes in Mike's credibility, insinuating that Mike was fired for incompetence. Mike calmly responded that he'd quit and had references to prove it. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Richard shot daggers at Mike, who pretended not to notice. When Greg Phillips tried to cross-examine him, Mike stuck to the facts, never veering into speculation. He explained line by line how each invoice was tweaked to add extra charges. By the end of his testimony, even the jury members who'd seemed unsure were giving Richard a hard stare. Judge Hastings kept a stoic expression, but I sensed he wasn't pleased with Richard at all. It was during the next session, when Richard was called back to the stand, that the real fireworks began. Greg Phillips, looking more nervous than before, asked a series of boilerplate questions meant to minimize the damage. Then Dan approached with a folder of documents. He asked Richard, point blank, if he'd seen these specific invoices before. Richard, apparently confident, said no, absolutely not. He'd never seen them in his life. Dan then asked him if he was sure. Richard insisted that yes, he was sure, and repeated it under oath. That's when Dan smoothly introduced an email exchange between Richard and Sean, the subject line reading, "Adjusted Invoices." The email itself contained attachments with the same file names as the documents in Dan's folder. The email was dated the week before those invoices were submitted to me for payment. You could feel the collective intake of breath in the courtroom. Richard's face went from flushed to ashen. He tried to explain it away, stammering nonsense about how maybe it was a draft. But Dan had the follow-up email, too, in which Richard wrote, "Make sure these are the ones we use." At that moment, Judge Hastings leaned forward and said, "Mr. Carter, are you stating under oath that you have no recollection of these invoices?" Richard, cornered, sputtered something about memory issues, about being busy with other projects, anything to wriggle out of the trap. The judge's gaze was ice cold. "Let me remind you," he said, "that perjury in my courtroom has severe consequences." The entire place fell silent. Even Greg Phillips looked like he wanted to disappear under the defense table. Richard tried to maintain his composure, but the jury was visibly unimpressed. One of them actually rolled her eyes. That was the moment I knew. We had him. No more excuses, no more lies. He had lied under oath, been caught red-handed, and the evidence was irrefutable. The last few days of the trial were almost anticlimactic after that bombshell. We introduced more backup evidence, hammered the point home that Richard orchestrated the scheme with Sean, and that he'd tried to pin it on me to cover his tracks. Greg Phillips did his best to paint me as incompetent, implying that I hadn't managed the funds carefully. But it was too late. That smoking gun had destroyed Richard's credibility entirely. When the time came for closing arguments, Dan summarized all the ways Richard had lied, including the moment he was directly confronted with the emails. Phillips's closing was subdued, lacking the arrogant flourish he'd shown at the start of the trial. On the day of the verdict, I felt a mix of dread and anticipation. Judge Hastings read the jury's decision. They found in my favor on nearly all counts. They rejected Richard's claim against me and upheld my countersuit for fraud. I was awarded damages for the stolen funds, plus legal fees. But the real knockout was the separate matter of perjury. The judge didn't mince words, declaring that it was abundantly clear Richard had lied under oath. He scheduled a separate hearing to address sanctions and potential criminal charges for perjury. I actually felt a little sorry for Richard in that instant, because his entire world was about to come crashing down. Then I remembered how he'd tried to ruin me, and that sympathy evaporated. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt a swell of relief. My reputation was intact, justice was served, and Richard's deception had been laid bare for everyone to see. Reporters who'd been covering local real estate disputes showed up, shoving microphones in my face and asking about the case. I declined most interviews, content to let the court documents speak for themselves. The rumor mill worked overtime, and by the end of the week, Richard's name was tarnished in real estate circles. He ended up losing more business partners as word spread of his attempted fraud. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that he was also under investigation for other financial dealings, likely uncovered during the trial process. Karma was making a thorough sweep of his life. The day I finally closed that chapter, I was back in my office looking at a framed photograph of the first property I'd ever sold. I remembered all the hard work I'd put into my career, the trust I'd built with clients, and how easily it could have been destroyed by Richard's lies. But it hadn't been, because in the end, facts and truth had won out. If there's one thing I took away from this entire nightmare, it's that liars can seem confident for a time, but sooner or later, their stories collapse under their own weight. Richard had tried to stand tall on a foundation of falsehoods, but once the light of scrutiny shone on him, that foundation crumbled. A few weeks later, I heard from Mike Turner. He'd found a new job with a reputable contractor and thanked me for doing the right thing, saying he was relieved that the truth came out. I thanked him for his courage in standing up in court. It couldn't have been easy for him to testify against his former boss, but he did it because it was the right thing to do. Even Sean, I heard, ended up facing legal trouble. He reached out to me indirectly, trying to negotiate some settlement that would keep me from testifying in future lawsuits against him. I refused. I wasn't going to enable or protect someone who helped steal from me and then lied about it. The day I got official confirmation that the court had found Richard guilty of perjury was the day I finally felt that karmic weight settle. People talk about karma as some mystical force, but to me it's simply the reality that you can't hide the truth forever. That day in court when Richard's face drained of color and he realized he had no way out, that was karma coming to collect. And it didn't just collect a small debt, it took everything he owed. In the months following the trial, I spent a lot of time rebuilding. I had to reassure clients that my business was still solid, my reputation still untarnished. Luckily, the local media coverage had been sympathetic, painting me as the victim of a conniving partner. After the dust settled, I felt stronger, more determined than ever. I'd gone through a public legal battle, faced heartbreak and betrayal, and yet, here I was, still standing. I realized that all the sleepless nights, all the stress, had culminated in a moment of triumph when justice was served. There's no better feeling than watching someone who tried to destroy you face the consequences of their own lies. I wish I could say Richard vanished from my life entirely, but I did get one more message from him, an email about a month after the trial. It was half-baked, some odd mixture of blame-shifting and half-apology, telling me that we could have worked something out if I hadn't been so stubborn. I just shook my head in disbelief and promptly forwarded it to Dan, who told me to ignore it unless it contained any direct legal threat. It didn't. It was just a pathetic attempt to rewrite the narrative one more time. I blocked his email and moved on. What I learned from this is that no matter how much you trust someone, you have to protect yourself with documentation, clear communication, and a willingness to dig deeper if things start smelling fishy. If you're ever in a situation where you suspect wrongdoing, document everything. Because when the time comes and you find yourself in a courtroom facing a liar, your best weapon is evidence, and a calm, steady faith in the truth. That's what carried me through. And that's what left Richard stuttering in front of the judge, exposed for the fraud he was. Sometimes I think back to that pivotal moment, the hush in the courtroom when Richard insisted he'd never seen those invoices before in his life, and Dan slid that damning email across the podium. The terror in Richard's eyes was a sight I'll never forget. It was like watching a house of cards come crashing down in an instant. He tried to scramble for a lie, but his own words from the email pinned him against the wall. Everyone in that courtroom knew the game was over. If there was ever a moment that perfectly captured the concept of immediate karmic backlash, that was it. In the end, the final ruling favored me completely. I recouped most of the stolen money, minus legal fees that Richard was ordered to pay but never fully did. Still, the moral victory was sweet. I resumed my real estate career, cleaned up the mess he'd left, and am now more successful than ever. Word got around that I was the guy who would stand up for himself and expose anyone who tried to con him. Ironically, the ordeal boosted my reputation in certain circles. People respect honesty, and they respect someone who won't let a bully walk all over them. Do I regret partnering with Richard in the first place? Sometimes, but if I hadn't, I might never have learned how crucial it is to protect yourself legally. I might never have discovered that I had the resilience to stare down a smug liar in court and refuse to back down. It was an expensive lesson, but in the grand scheme of things, it changed me for the better. Now, when I look at new potential partnerships, I approach them with a bit more caution and a lot more diligence. Yet I haven't let cynicism consume me. There are good people out there who won't betray your trust. I just learned the hard way how to spot the warning signs early on. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Richard had just come clean, or if he'd never tried to shift the blame to me. Maybe we could have parted ways amicably, but that's not the path he chose. He dug himself a hole, and when he realized I was onto him, he tried to bury me in it instead. He miscalculated. He thought I was too naive or too broke to fight back. He assumed he could spin a lie under oath and no one would be the wiser. But he underestimated how determined I was, and how relentless Dan could be once he smelled blood in the water. In the end, Richard got a face full of his own lies. That's the story of how my former business partner tried to lie under oath and got exposed in the most dramatic way possible. It taught me that the truth has a power of its own, and when you're armed with real evidence, a liar's fancy words crumble pretty quick. If there's a moral to this tale, it's that honesty really does matter. Lies might look shiny in the short term, but eventually they rust away and reveal the ugly reality beneath. Nothing can protect a liar from the moment facts are laid bare for everyone to see. And in that moment, no amount of excuses or slick talking will save them. After all this, I moved on to new ventures, expanded my clientele, and continued renovating properties. But this time, I chose my partners very carefully. I stayed in touch with Dan, who went on to represent a few other people wronged by shady business associates. We still laugh about some of the theatrics that took place in court, though at the time, it was dead serious for me. And I still keep an eye out for any rumor or whiff of Richard's involvement in the business world, just to make sure he can't pull the same stunt on anyone else I know. Last I heard, he left California altogether, possibly to start fresh in another state. But with a perjury charge on his record, his options are likely limited. Looking back, I'm proud of how I handled it. I was scared, angry, and at times overwhelmed, but I never compromised on telling the truth. I faced him with solid evidence and refused to be bullied. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember that documentation, patience, and a good lawyer can be your strongest allies. And never underestimate the power of karma, or simply the universe's way of ensuring that lies don't stay hidden for long. Because no matter how clever someone thinks they are, once they raise their right hand and swear to tell the truth, that lie is sitting on a ticking time bomb. All it takes is one piece of evidence to blow it wide open. I still get asked sometimes about the day in court, when Judge Hastings turned to Richard and gave him that lethal stare, the one that said, "I know exactly what you've done." They want to know how it felt to see someone who had tried to destroy me lose his composure on the stand. I've never found the right words to describe it. It was satisfying, obviously, but it was also a cautionary moment for me. How easily trust can be betrayed, how destructive greed can be. I took no small pleasure in seeing justice served, but more than that, I felt relief that the truth had finally come out. And so, if ever anyone asks, what's the most karmic court moment you've witnessed where someone tried to lie under oath and got exposed immediately? I just smile and say, let me tell you about the time my ex-business partner thought he could outsmart the truth. Bonus story. I could hear the gavel strike before I actually saw Judge Morrison lower. That crack resounded in the courtroom and everyone, attorneys, spectators, my former best friend turned nemesis, fell silent, eyes snapping forward. My heart pounded in my ears, partly from the tension that had built over the last couple of months, and partly because I could sense we were finally nearing the moment of truth. I glanced at Trent, the man who used to be like a brother to me, now standing in a tailored gray suit at the witness stand. He looked too confident for someone who was about to get his entire web of lies torn apart. The judge's gaze cut right through him, and I wondered if he could feel it too. Maybe this was the exact second he realized the story he'd spun was on the verge of collapsing, and that the real truth was poised to burst forth in front of everyone. I can't pretend I knew it would end up like this when it all started, but I remember the first time I realized something was off. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, a few months back, and I was coming home after a long day spent at City Hall trying to finalize some building permits for my newly inherited land. I'm Blake Evans, by the way, and I used to live in a small apartment in Cedar Creek before my grandfather passed away and left me his farmland. That farm was supposed to be my next big project, a dream of turning it into a sustainable orchard that honored his memory. I wasn't raised as a farmer myself, but my grandpa used to say I had a green thumb and a relentless spirit, and he believed I could bring the land back to life after years of neglect. The trouble was that, somewhere along the line, I made the decision to confide in Trent Phillips. He and I had been best friends since high school. We'd played baseball together, dreamed about getting out of our small town, and always had each other's backs. Or so I believed. When the farmland fell into my lap, Trent was the first person to say, "Hey, let's go into business together. We'll modernize the orchard, maybe add a distillery for fruit brandy or cider, and make a fortune." He already had a background in small-scale financing and seemed like the perfect partner, especially since I was more concerned with the actual land management than the money side of things. For the first few weeks, everything looked promising. Trent accompanied me to the farmland, jotted down figures in a notebook, and talked about potential investors. I was busy figuring out irrigation, soil treatments, orchard layout. We were both excited, or at least it felt that way. The orchard had a few surviving apple trees, some pears, and a cluster of walnut trees on the far north side. The land itself was rolling and picturesque, the kind of place you could turn into a successful agritourism spot if you had enough funds and a good plan. The first time I sensed danger was when Trent came, all sweaty and frantic, saying something about a shortfall in the startup capital. According to him, if we didn't inject more money right away, we'd lose out on a grant from the county, and all our preliminary expenses, hiring surveyors, cleaning up the old barn, upgrading the irrigation system, would be for nothing. He told me he'd found a bridging loan we could use, but it had to be signed as soon as possible. My gut churned. I'd never been a big fan of rushed decisions, but we were under time pressure, and I trusted Trent's judgment. I signed on the dotted line. It wouldn't be until much later that I discovered the bridging loan was just the tip of the iceberg. Over the next month, Trent's behavior became erratic. He was flustered one day, overly enthusiastic the next. I chalked it up to stress. Then he started asking for my signature on various documents, telling me these were standard forms for local government grants or project expansions. Sometimes I barely had time to read them thoroughly. I was knee-deep in orchard logistics, trying to hire workers and sort out an organic certification. Still, something in the pit of my stomach kept nagging, warning me to slow down and question what was really on those papers. Around that time, I got a call from an old family acquaintance, Meredith Clark, who worked in the county records office. She asked me why I had transferred partial ownership of the farmland to a newly formed LLC. My heart skipped a beat. I had done no such thing. I told her that must be some kind of error. But her voice was firm. "Blake, I have your signature." That was the moment my blood ran cold. Could it be that the documents I signed were not what Trent said they were? I confronted him immediately, but he brushed it off, claiming the partial ownership was just a technical step needed for securing certain investors. He said we'd revert it back once the orchard was up and running. He looked me in the eye and insisted he'd never betray me. I forced myself to believe him for a little while longer, but from that day on, I secretly kept track of every document we filed. My trust was shaken, and I wanted to see if I could catch him doing something shady. I had no idea how dark it was about to get. One morning, I drove out to the orchard and discovered that a crew of bulldozers had started clearing a swath of the land. They'd even uprooted a row of my precious apple trees, which I'd been nurturing for months. When I asked the bulldozer operator who gave the order, he said he was contracted by the property owner. I shouted that I was the owner, and he looked confused, muttering that his instructions came from a Mr. Phillips. I was furious. I told them to stop immediately. The head of the crew eventually complied, though he insisted on seeing proof that I was the rightful owner. Proof of my own land. I marched into town, found Trent, and demanded an explanation. He claimed he was creating a better access road for potential investors and insisted that uprooting the trees had been necessary for future expansion. I nearly lost it. That's when he dropped the bombshell. "Listen, Blake, I've already put down a lot of money. You're stretched thin, and I can't keep propping up this orchard if you're going to micromanage me." He made it sound like I was the ungrateful one. My mind whirled. How could my best friend talk to me like I was just an obstacle in his plan? It didn't take long for the real meltdown to happen. I went home and dug through the stack of papers I'd signed. Some were legitimate orchard-related forms. Others were mortgage documents, transferring huge chunks of my farmland as collateral to secure private loans. One or two even described entire sections of the orchard as belonging to an LLC that Trent controlled. I felt sick. This was not a simple misunderstanding. He was systematically taking ownership out from under me. I decided I needed a lawyer, so I reached out to Michelle Barnett, someone with a stellar reputation for dealing with property disputes. She listened to my story, looked over the documents, and shook her head in disbelief. "He's clearly forging some details here," she said, pointing to suspicious variations in the notary stamps. "But we need to move fast, or he'll try to sell this orchard to a third party." Before we could file an injunction, I received a legal notice. Trent was suing me for breach of contract, claiming I'd failed to meet certain conditions and thus forfeited my rights to the orchard. My jaw nearly hit the floor. It was surreal, reading those allegations. He said I'd withheld funds, lied about the property's value, and even violated an agreement that barred me from making decisions without his consent. He was effectively painting me as the unscrupulous partner. But I had the messages, the original deeds, and a witness who might help, an old farmhand named Walt who'd been a friend of my grandfather. Walt had seen Trent on the property multiple times, Overheard him talking about how he was planning to flip the orchard to some big developer. Walt was nobody's fool. He'd kept a journal of suspicious activities he'd noticed. When I found that out, I almost cried with relief. The legal battle began in earnest. We had preliminary hearings that felt like marathons of paperwork and frustration. Trent came to court looking smug, accompanied by a high-priced attorney named Lance Porter. Porter was slick and articulate, spinning a narrative that I was the incompetent caretaker of a valuable property and that Trent had saved me from bankruptcy. My lawyer, Michelle, countered with the original will from my grandfather, the orchard's official deed, and a barrage of evidence that questioned the legitimacy of the LLC transfers. We got the judge to temporarily block any sale or destruction of orchard property until the matter was settled in a full trial. Of course, the case escalated. We discovered that Trent had tried to pay a local notary to falsify a few key signatures. That notary ended up recanting her statement under oath, saying she was threatened by Trent to keep quiet. Meanwhile, Trent's side kept doubling down, insisting I was forging signatures myself and that he had concrete proof. It turned into a circus, and I wondered how we'd ever cut through the noise. Fast forward to the day of the main trial. Tensions were at an all-time high. It was in the same courthouse where my grandfather had once settled a boundary dispute decades ago. Ironically enough, my entire future, my livelihood, my grandpa's legacy, was on the line. The room buzzed with murmured speculation as both sides lined up at the plaintiff's and defendant's tables. Trent was the plaintiff, having sued me for breach of contract, while I countersued for fraud. The first few witnesses didn't reveal. They were mostly local officials confirming the orchard's location, boundaries, and potential commercial value. Then Trent took the stand. His performance was worthy of an Oscar, if you didn't know the truth. He talked about how he'd known me since we were kids, how he'd tried to save me from my own inexperience, and how he'd sunk his personal fortune into the orchard, only for me to sabotage everything by refusing to stick to the plan. I clenched my fists under the table, anger boiling as he lied so smoothly. He produced a stack of documents, copies of the ones he'd made me sign, and insisted these were valid. His attorney asked leading questions that allowed him to recite the same narrative over and over, that I was financially reckless, that he was the savior. The judge listened, expression unreadable. Michelle stood up for the cross-examination, as poised as ever. She slowly and methodically questioned Trent about the timeline of these so-called agreements. She pointed out discrepancies in dates, differences in notary stamps, contradictory statements in the documents themselves. Trent seemed to handle it well enough at first. He had an explanation for everything, claiming any mismatched date was just a typo or an administrative oversight. Then Michelle asked him, "Mr. Phillips, is it your testimony under oath that you personally witnessed Blake signing every single one of these documents in front of a notary?" He looked her straight in the eye and said, "Yes, absolutely." Michelle paused, then asked the judge to enter a piece of evidence, a video file from a security camera at the notary's office. She played it. The footage showed Trent walking into the notary's office with a stack of papers, but the notary was absent that day, and he left them on the desk with a note. It never showed me entering the office at all. In fact, I was out of town that entire week. The judge's gaze flicked up from the screen, scanning Trent's reaction. Trent tried to claim the timestamps were off, that maybe the footage was incomplete, but it was painfully obvious that he'd been caught lying. The notary had also provided a sworn statement saying I was never present for those signings. A hush fell over the room. Still, that wasn't the final blow. Trent regrouped, claiming, "Well, maybe I confused this particular set of documents with the earlier ones, but the rest is all real." He stuck to his guns. My heart pounded. If the judge suspected some minor confusion, maybe he'd let Trent off with a slap on the wrist. But Michelle had more ammunition. She presented text messages showing Trent directing his acquaintances to backdate certain notary entry. The messages were explicit. My name was mentioned. My orchard was mentioned. The instructions were blatant. Make sure the signature date for Blake is March 14th, not March 19th. He can't have signed after the mortgage rate changed. And so on. The judge stared at the phone records, at the proof that Trent was orchestrating a fraud. You could practically feel the tension shift in the courtroom, like a bubble bursting. It was at that precise moment, with the air thick enough to choke on, that the judge leaned forward. "Mr. Phillips, please look at the messages in front of you. Are you alleging these are fake?" Trent's voice waved. He stammered something about fabrications, then claimed he'd never sent them. Or maybe someone else used his phone. He was desperate, and the gallery behind us started to murmur. The judge had to rap the gavel to restore order. Michelle looked calm but relentless. "Your Honor, we have here phone records from Trent Phillips' personal cell, verified by the carrier. The times, dates, and recipients match perfectly. If Mr. Phillips insists these are forgeries, we can subpoena the recipients who are prepared to testify. She paused, letting it sink in. Shall we do that? The judge's eyes flicked to Trent, waiting for his response. Trent's attorney tried to object, saying they needed more time to review, but the judge overruled him. We're already in trial. Mr. Phillips had ample time to challenge discovery. He did not. Then the judge turned to Trent again, voice stern. You have sworn under oath that all these documents were signed in your presence by Mr. Evans. The evidence strongly contradicts this statement. I need an explanation. Right now. It was then I saw the spark of pure panic in Trent's eyes. He'd reached the cliff's edge. Either he could backtrack or he could keep lying. He chose the latter, doubling down. I stand by my statement, Your Honor. There must be a mix-up in the phone records. I swear on everything I never faked a single piece of paper. That's when Michelle presented one final piece, an affidavit from the local notary, in which she explicitly stated she was bribed by Trent to stamp documents I hadn't signed. She'd included pictures of text message threads, checks with Trent's signature for consulting fees, and more. The hush turned into a gasp around the court. Judge Morrison slowly looked up from the affidavit. So, Mr. Phillips, you're telling me that multiple pieces of evidence, from security footage to text messages to sworn statements, are all lying, but you alone are telling the truth? Trent's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed, and he must have realized the hole he dug was too deep to climb out of. I saw a flash in his eyes, something like defeat or maybe rage. He was used to being the slick talker, the confident, but in that moment, it all fell apart. He'd been fully exposed, and there was no escape. The judge called a brief recess. I stepped outside into the hallway, lungs quivering as if I'd just run a marathon. Michelle gave me a reassuring nod, though I could see she was exhausted. The tension that had been building for months was finally releasing, and I was fighting back waves of relief and anger. I leaned against the wall, closed my eyes, and breathed. We still had to finish the trial, but I knew we'd turned the tide for good. There was no coming back from that level of direct, documented perjury. When we returned to the courtroom, Judge Morrison wasted no time. He asked Trent to step down from the witness stand and instructed the bailiff to escort him to his seat. The judge then made a statement in front of everyone that perjury was a serious offense, and that if the trial concluded with conclusive evidence of false testimony, he would consider referring the matter to the district attorney's office. Trent's lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. I noticed a flicker of fear on Trent's face, as if he finally grasped the legal ramifications. This wasn't just about losing a lawsuit. He could be facing criminal charges. Walt, my grandfather's old farmhand, took the stand next. He was in his 70s, a man of few words but unshakable honesty. He detailed how he'd seen Trent a dozen times meeting with a shady-looking real estate broker, discussing potential developments on land that was still legally mine. He'd overheard Trent mention he was the majority owner, which confused Walt. That conversation happened weeks before I ever supposedly signed those documents. Walt's words were slow, clear, and rang with authenticity. He even read from his notebook where he jotted down dates and times. The judge listened intently, occasionally glancing at Trent, whose face was by now an unhealthy shade of gray. By the time closing arguments rolled around, it felt like the outcome was inevitable. Michelle wove a compelling narrative that Trent systematically orchestrated a plan to wrest control of my land and that he lied under oath to hide his actions. Trent's attorney attempted a desperate he said approach, vaguely suggesting I was the one fabricating. But the evidence was overwhelming. When the jury went to deliberate, I clutched the edge of the table, hardly daring to hope they'd see the truth as clearly as I did. I didn't have to wait long. They came back quicker than most juries do in a complex property dispute. The verdict was unanimous. I was vindicated, Trent's claims were dismissed, and my countersuit for fraud succeeded. The judge declared that all documents transferring ownership to Trent or any LLC under his control were null and void. He also stated in open court that he was seriously considering referring the case for a criminal perjury investigation. Trent looked visibly deflated, a man whose bravado had vanished into thin air. My insides felt like fireworks and collapsing stars all at once. A mix of triumph, relief, and heartbreak that it had come to this with someone I'd once trusted like a brother. Walking out of the courtroom that afternoon, I was bombarded with a rush of reporters from a local news station. They'd apparently gotten wind that a big property trial had concluded with allegations of forgery and perjury. My only comment was that I was grateful the truth had prevailed, and I wanted to focus on rebuilding my orchard. I had no interest in humiliating Trent further. My orchard was safe. My grandfather's legacy remained in the family. That was enough. In the weeks that followed, the The district attorney did open an investigation into Trent's potential perjury and fraud. I was called in to give a statement, as was the notary and Walt. I heard rumors that some of Trent's business associates distanced themselves from him. A few local banks blacklisted him from future loans. I guess that was the start of his personal downfall, or maybe it was simply karma in action. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel some sense of grim satisfaction, but mostly I felt drained. My orchard was safe, yes, but I was left to pick up the pieces of a broken friendship and the battered finances left in Trent's wake. The orchard itself needed major TLC. The bulldozed strip of land had to be restored, and half those apple trees were gone for good. I poured my energy into replanting, enlisting volunteers from the local 4-H club, and even some well-meaning neighbors who'd heard about the court case and wanted to help. Every sapling we planted felt like a small victory over the lies that had almost destroyed my entire future. My lawyer, Michelle, kept tabs on the civil side of things, making sure the courts enforced the ruling that nullified all fraudulent documents. It took months of paperwork, but we eventually cleaned up the property records, restoring the orchard fully to my name. One day, as I was inspecting the newly planted rows, I got an unexpected visit from Meredith Clark, the clerk who'd first alerted me that something was wrong with my property's title. She was beaming. She congratulated me on standing up against fraud and told me there was a rumor floating around that the local agriculture board wanted to feature my orchard in an upcoming piece about sustainable farming transitions. Apparently, people found my story inspiring. The idea that you could stand tall against deception, fight for your land, and come out on top. I thanked her and said I'd love to be involved in such a feature. If that narrative could encourage even one person to double-check documents or trust their instincts when something felt off, it would be worth it. As for Trent, the last I heard, he was facing not only a potential criminal case but also a mountain of debt. His so-called investors were furious at having been strung along with false promises. Some of them threatened to sue him as well. He vanished from the local scene, possibly moving out of state. I can't say I miss him, even though part of me sometimes reminisces about the days when we were just two kids playing catch. If you'd told me back then that he'd grow up to try and steal my land, I'd never have believed you. Sometimes people ask if I regret ever telling him about the orchard in the first place. I don't. Maybe that sounds strange, but in a way, this ordeal taught me lessons I wouldn't have learned otherwise. I learned how to stand up for what's right, how to protect myself legally, and how to recognize red flags in a partnership. More importantly, it showed me that there are good folks in the world, like Michelle, Walt, and Meredith, who step forward when injustice rears its head. Without them, I might have lost everything. Now, whenever I walk through the orchard, especially in the early morning when the dew glistens on the leaves, I feel a deep sense of peace. The air smells of fresh earth and possibility. I can almost hear my grandfather's voice telling me I did okay, that I kept the farm and the family just as he hoped. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of Walt puttering around on the tractor, wearing a grin that says, "We won this land back, and we did, no matter how close we came to losing it." That sense of renewal is something no amount of money or scheming can take away. Every so often, I'll get a phone call from a reporter or a curious friend asking for the full story. Is it true he lied under oath? They'll ask. Did he really try to bribe a notary? I usually just laugh a little sadly and say, it's all on the record, because it is. Court transcripts don't lie. And the judge's scathing rebuke of Trent's perjury remains a testament to the fact that you can't outrun the truth forever. That's the moment I think back to, the one in the courtroom where the judge pinned Trent with a glare so fierce he practically melted. It was the exact second everyone saw the liar unmasked. If that isn't karma, I don't know what is. In a strange way, I'm grateful for that climactic day in court. Sure, it was terrifying to lay my life open for scrutiny, to risk everything on the hope that the truth would outshine the lies. But it did. And there's something poetic about that final moment when the judge threatened Trent with perjury charges. It was a reminder that words, especially sworn testimony, really do carry weight. You can bluff your way through a lot of situations in life, but once you're under oath, the game changes. Some people forget that and pay dearly. These days, I've expanded the orchard, adding a small line of organic jams and ciders that local stores carry. The orchard hosts seasonal picking events, hay rides in the fall, and a small farm stand that sells fresh produce. It's become a gathering place for the community, a point of pride for Cedar Creek. Sometimes I'll strike up a conversation with visitors who mention they heard about the orchard's big lawsuit. I just smile and say, we had a little trouble a while back, but we weathered it. And that, I think, is the real takeaway. We weathered the orchard. Walt, Michelle, me. We stood against a man who tried to twist the facts for his own profit. And while it was a hard road, and the farmland still bears some scars from bulldozers, we came out stronger. Those new saplings are taking root, And with every passing season, they grow taller and bear more fruit, just like my confidence in the truth. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that no matter how neatly someone packages a lie, reality has a way of seeping through the cracks. And when it does, no fancy suit or well-paid lawyer can seal it back up. That's the story of how I nearly lost my inheritance to the best friend I thought I'd always trust, how I ended up in a courthouse watching him lie under oath, and how, in the end, he was exposed by the very facts he tried to bury. I'll never forget the sound of that gavel, the hush in the room, or the look on Trent's face as the evidence piled up. I guess you could say I saw karma strike in real time, and it was as swift and certain as a hammer hitting a nail. The orchard stands as living proof that if you fight for what's right, you just might win. And when liars try to spin a false narrative in a court of law, they tend to learn the hard way that truth isn't so easily silenced.